having children in a climate crisis. It's a question and a real concern, an unsettling concern. A new documentary called Climate Baby Dilemma will be premiering Friday, November 25th at 9 p.m. on CBC Docs Original, and it'll be on the CBC Gem streaming service. And Victoria Lean is the writer and director. Victoria, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Victoria, you have a number of screen productions in your filmography, and you've received a number of awards for your work. And it leads me to ask you, what got you into this subject?
Yeah, it's a great question. So science, the environment, what's happening to the planet is covered in a lot of my work. My parents are environmental scientists, so I grew up talking about the state of the world at a pretty young age. And I always felt like needing to find better ways to communicate what was happening to the general public and find ways that it really connects with people. And I know a few other climate science journalists, and so Britt Ray is, I've known her for many years. I really admire her work. And we were having dinner and talking about the topic of climate change and communicating it. And what she was finding was how many other, she'd recently gotten married, and she was really having a hard time deciding whether or not she wanted to have kids, knowing what she knows about the state of the world and what it's going to look like for a child over the next 20 years. And so we talked about making that connection. I think so often people talk about the climate crisis as a faraway horror or something that happens in other places. But when you talk about what it means for a child that you know or a child that you care about in the future, it really personalizes it. So I started filming with her, and she did a TED Talk that was connecting kind of the climate crisis to the mental health impacts. The mental health impacts of the climate crisis. And one of the urgent indicators of how people are feeling is the growing number of people that are deciding not to have kids or are hesitant about having kids because of the climate crisis. So I wanted to do this documentary to sort of unpack the various ways the concern gets misunderstood, and also what's driving it, what people can do, how they can work through it, what it means. And I also find that it does help personalize the stakes of the climate crisis, because the future and what it looks like really comes into light with whether it's a child you have or a grandchild or a niece or a nephew, when you think about what the world will look like when they're your age. So it was great to follow people who are thinking about that with such intentionality and care.
Well, someone such as myself at my age really doesn't think about this sort of thing. And as I watched a preview of your documentary, it was really unsettling and certainly brought home to me what the world is going to be like for my grandchildren, of which I have a number. And it was extremely unsettling. And Dr. Ray did a lovely job of presenting the mental health concerns of this crisis. And I was surprised. I was very surprised that there are many groups around the world that are in support of this concept about bringing children into a climate challenged world. And I guess my question to you is, were you surprised, or were you aware that this is popping up not just in our own neighborhood, but in countries right around the world?
So when I started the project with Britt, she was just sort of wondering whether or not this was just something in our circles that we were finding. And then so she found one group called Conceivable Future, and we in the film have a conceivable future. They're called house parties. So it's more no one I met And this is a very important distinction, and I think it's very easy for people to misunderstand. No one I met is telling other people they shouldn't have kids. What they're saying is they're expressing a fear that they have. It's a plea for action because they feel like they can't have kids. So having a child is a fundamental human right, and many of, especially Gen Z, feel that that right is being taken not from them because of government inaction on climate. So, conceivable future is more like a small group that helps people work through these questions, and it helps people tap into sort of the political power of it as well, because once you connect climate change to a child in your life you care about, that can be really motivating, and it helps people channel like why they're getting into activism. And so two other groups sort of popped up after I had already started filming with Brit. So in 2019, around the youth climate strikes, Emma Lim, who is one of the organizers, I follow her in the big, huge Montreal march with Greta Thunberg, she launches a pledge, and it's just for other young people to sign as a way to express their fear and hopefully get the attention of media. And then there was another group similarly in the UK called Birth Strike that was gathering people's testimonials. So both of these groups no longer exist, actually. They came about at a time where the No Future Pledge was really a campaign that came about around the time of the last federal election, to really get some movement on climate. But these movements are really hard. It's such a personal conversation, and I think it was very daunting for both movements to manage the ways that it could be hijacked by the media. So, or just pundits or people not interpreting what it was about. For instance, Birth Strike getting confused with population control and that dark history, and no one in the movement wanted to be associated from that. But it's just when you start talking about kids and whether or not to have them, people are like, oh yeah, the world's overpopulated, but people in the developing world, they're having all these kids and we're not having enough here. Like, it kind of gets into an icky conversation, and moderating that was quite difficult. So both groups ended up not really continuing on, but they were more a manifestation of a fear that a lot of people were having, and wanting to put a name to it. But now, even it doesn't need a movement for it to be. I would say it's more of a sociological phenomenon now.
Mhm.
So the birth rate is dropping, and a lot of surveys. There's a variety of surveys that have confirmed it. And it's especially more common among Gen Z than millennials. One study that Brit was a part of that surveyed 10,000 youth around the world, ages 16 to 25 in 10 countries, they found that 39% of them said that the climate crisis makes them hesitant to have children. So that's a lot, 39%.
It is. And
Yeah.
the young people that you talk to, um, they had they were so well defined in their thinking. Um, they had given this a lot of sober thought, and I'm sure you were impressed with how they were able to verbalize their concerns.
Yeah, and I think that's also what's really important. Uh, a lot of people, no one comes to these decisions lightly, and there's so much intentionality and thought and care, which was quite beautiful in making the film. And I think it's very easy, especially with some of the younger women, like they're expressing a fear that they have in the future, 10 years from now. And so someone older might be, oh, well, like, and they would tell me this, that when they're talking about it, they would be dismissed, like, oh, well, when you get older and you meet someone, maybe your opinions would change. And that's not the way to respond to those types of things. And you know what? Some of them hope that their decision will change, but their decision will change only if there's dramatic change at a government level on policies regarding climate. So I think that was an interesting process of in making the film, is talking about like more emotionally intelligent forms of communication are really important when you're talking about these things and not
Talking
just
about
dismissing them.
talking about emotional um, presentations. Um, you were talking with the Indigenous activist, Serene Fox,
Hmm.
and I was quite moved by how emotional she was, and it was a somewhat different view of the problem. Is this something you expected?
No, I don't think so. I didn't expect, I was, what you don't see on the other side of the camera is that I was also crying through parts of her interview. Like we were both sobbing and it was quite emotional. And so Serene Fox is an activist and she decides, she articulates how for Indigenous communities, they've had to like they're the way she puts it is like having a child um is so important because the community is trying to survive genocide, really. So it's an important way to pass on culture and tradition, and it's so much more informed by a political history, and it's also really important to look at Indigenous, Black, racialized communities that have had to have children for hundreds of years under the shadow of colonialism and haven't been able to take the safety of their child in the future for granted. And I think that's one of the more beautiful and profound things about the film is that for communities like white European, we've been able to exist outside of genocide, and this is really the first time that we're experiencing a world in which we can't take for granted that our children will be safe. And so, in that sense, I think like Britt and Serene talking about this fear as being a way to have empathy and like a window into the fear that other communities have historically felt for their children, and how that's actually quite powerful in order to kind of build solidarity and work towards more climate justice solutions.
It was very powerful, very powerful.
Mhm.
I was a little bit taken aback when we were introduced to David Suzuki's daughter, and I discovered that David Suzuki wasn't very happy when he heard his daughter was pregnant. Uh, was that a surprising story to you?
I had actually heard it before from Britt. She mentions it too. She had talked to him in her book. Um, but it's not surprising in a lot of ways. There's an older environmentalist crowd, my dad in particular, like they've been working on environmental issues for 40 years and it hasn't really gotten better. Some things have gotten better, but um, I think David felt a lot of the same fear that a lot of young climate activists have, but their story and Severn, um, and how she explained it to him and how his views changed. So it's not a story. It's more of like his initial reaction was like, "Oh no, don't you know what's happening to the world?" And then her intentional thinking through what
Yeah.
having a child means, and that she's invested in the future, and that she's having a child out of hope that what we're doing is going to work, that we can build a safe future for our children. So it's not giving up, in a sense.
When we see governments coming together to meet at COP22, and I feel despondent because I know at the end of it, it's going to be less than we all hope for. It's going to be less than what's needed. And your documentary provides a very powerful um, adjunct to that kind of story because it says, look, there are people out here who are waiting, and we are urgently looking for governments to get organized and get it together. Is your hope that your documentary will have some sort of public support in this regard?
I think that the hope of my documentary is more specific, in the sense, like, I've made other films. The series I finished recently, We're All Gonna Die, Ethan J. Baruchel, which is on Crave. There's the climate episode. And that one is, a lesson coming out of that is how much more governments need to be taking into taking action broadly. But for this documentary, what I hope is that it this is a conversation that is very personal. It is happens in private. You don't need to talk about it with other people, but talking about it with people in your community, in your family, is actually really powerful. And I hope it allows people to open up and work through those emotions. And maybe if they are feeling hesitation because of climate, they do, tell their parents that, hey, maybe you're not going to be a grandparent one day. And part of that is because, we have policies that aren't making a difference. And I hope that having that conversation in their homes and families might help other people wake up and say, oh, okay, like, we have got 9 years to avoid catastrophic climate change. I should be doing more to make sure that there's change for a grandchild or a child that I have, or maybe I won't,
Yeah.
that's, so that's what I'm hoping comes out of this film, is that it normalizes the conversation, because it is a very brave thing to do, to articulate that personal decision. And you don't need to, but I know that for people who have, it can be quite powerful.
One of your young people calls this activism an act of love. When I heard that, not only was I impressed, I was a little bit sad, but at the same time, a little bit hopeful. I thought, well, that's a lovely thing to say, and I'll bet you had a number of those kinds of occasions through the filming where people were just surprised you.
Yeah, I think that Peyton, her story, she comes from a family with grew up rural, agricultural and fossil fuel driven economy, near a coal plant, and family is so important. I met her family, I met her siblings. Her mom had her quite young. She thought she would have kids quite young. And her own working through the question is incredibly moving. And for her, ensuring that we have strong communities is a really drives her, and it's really a form of love and community for her. And I thought that was really powerful. And another young mother I met, she's in a digital scene that the CBC is releasing a standalone doc, and she had her child and then learned about climate change and felt so much despair. And the way she describes it is, once she found other communities of parents who were working towards these things, she felt like it can be really motivating when you connect climate work to the people and places that you care about. It's an expression of showing love, and that's also what Severn, in her Rio speech from 1992, Severn Suzuki, that we feature in the film, that was 30 years ago when she was 12 years old, and her son is now 12. So I wanted to speak with her about that and what she's learned. But the main thrust of that speech, and why it still gets shared today, is that it was powerful because it asked people at the UN to remember why they're here and remember their role as aunties and uncles. Sorry, I just knocked something over. Aunties and uncles and parents and community leaders, and what your obligation is. Like, don't you love us is the rest of it. So,
Well,
yeah.
throughout the documentary, the thoughts that are expressed are wide-ranging, and the approaches are extremely diverse. And throughout the whole piece, it's both informative, it's emotionally connecting, and I think people are really going to enjoy it. And I think they're going to take away some important thoughts to think about, and maybe share those with people that are in some sort of responsibility to urge them to think of all of us. And I congratulate you on it, and I wish you all the best on the premiere. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Victoria. It's wonderful chatting with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching the film and talking with me about it.
Victoria Lean is the writer and director of Climate Baby Dilemma. It premieres Friday, November 25th at 9 p.m. on CBC Docs Original and on the CBC Gem streaming service.